This is Larry Harnisch with part 2 of my reaction video to Steve Hodel's appearance on the Most Notorious podcast. This video runs a bit over 2 hours. I don't expect anyone to finish it. Watch the intro, watch the opening remarks, fast forward, scroll through it if you want to. There's a lot of material there. Okay, several people have complained that I interrupt Steve. Yes, that's the point. This is a reaction video, and this is how reaction videos work. If you want the original podcast, you can find it via Google. And if you have trouble understanding what Steve is saying, turn on the closed captioning. As before, we have Eric, a friendly host, a total believer, asking softball questions, and he lets Steve ramble. And boy, does Steve ramble. Rambles as usual. Steve says a lot of the same old thing. He has a script that he follows word for word, but as always, he will come up with new claims that are staggering. And that's kind of the fun. It's like, what is he going to throw into the same old boilerplate? This time, for example, he claims that Elizabeth Short was forced to eat feces. Okay, Steve stole that from John Gilmore's Severed. That's not new. But Steve adds, oh, she was forced to eat steer manure. And it's like, what? What? No, that's really, that's what he said. Another weird, bizarre, and wrong thing that Steve says is that Steve claims that Elizabeth Short posed for a Man Ray painting. No, she wasn't even in Los Angeles at the time, and she had no connection to Man Ray. So that's totally Steve World fantasy. And as I suspected, Steve also goes off the deep end on his map torture. Steve desperately wants Elizabeth Short's body, which was left on Norton Avenue, to have been left on Degnan. In reality, that's a couple of blocks away. Steve's latest bizarre claim is that Norton and Degnan are the same street. And he says this, and it's like, no. Norton is Norton and Degnan is Degnan. They are not the same street. He does this because he wants the crime scene to be a pointer to a killing in Chicago the year before of a little girl named Suzanne Degman. Steve desperately, oh so desperately, wants this to be true. And again, as dumb as this idea is, Steve stole it. Steve also does more about this Croton wristwatch. In reality, it was found by a young man, a teenager, about at least 100 yards, maybe more, away from the Black Dahlia crime scene. He was just kind of interested and poking around and found this old wristwatch a long distance away. Steve has decided that this wristwatch was either in proximity to Elizabeth Short's body or actually placed in the body as a taunt to the police. And Steve says, oh, well, I have pictures of my dad wearing this watch and the evidence is missing. Well, it wasn't evidence. It was a rusty old watch. This young man showed the wristwatch to the investigators and they go, oh, that's an interesting old watch. And that was the end of it. So there is no there except in the lunatic world of Steve Hodel. Again, Steve takes a couple of pot shots at LAPD homicide detective Brian Carr, who was the custodian of the Black Dahlia files when Steve wrote Black Dahlia Avenger. Brian Carr is 5 times the detective that Steve Hodel ever was. Remember that Steve never asked to see his dad's LAPD file before he wrote Black Dahlia Avenger. Brian told me, yeah, if Steve had come to me while he was writing the book and asked to see his dad's LAPD file, I would have showed it to him out of professional courtesy. Steve never asked to see the file. Only afterward, when he accused the LAPD of a cover-up and corruption and all that stuff, then says, can I see the file? And of course, the LAPD is never going to let him see it now. Steve has just can write that one off. Never, ever happen. I did okay on Steve Hodel Bingo. I didn't get 5 in a row, but I did get a couple of 4 in a row. And that's the adventure of Steve Hodel and his podcast and Steve World. And with that, here we go. This is Larry Harnisch with part 2 of Steve Hodel's presentation to the Most Notorious podcast. Again, I don't know what Steve is going to say. I always do this cold. So here we go. Let's share the screen.
So here's another way to support my show, and it won't cost you a red cent. Whenever you're in the mood to buy something from Amazon.com, go to my
blah,
website,
blah, blah, bye, 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 bye,
www.mostnotorious.com, and hit the Amazon link. A small percentage of the amount.
Let me point out that if there is music on this soundtrack, I am going to talk over it so that I don't get a copyright strike. So if there's spooky music like the first part, that's what I'm going to do.
Once it all adds up, I can continue bringing you interviews with the best and most interesting true crime history writers this wonderful world has to offer. Running this podcast has been a labor of love. The costs involved in time and money in putting this together every week are far higher than any small monetary reimbursement that I receive. As you have probably noticed, I haven't done much by way of advertising in the 24 odd shows that I've released. So I'm
odd shows. You know, Most Notorious is ranked 100th in history. It's not ranked in true crime. It's not ranked overall. It's a small niche podcast. And if Steve Hodel weren't doing it, I wouldn't bother with it. But we have Steve Hodel. What will he say this time?
Each and every week can help me continue to keep this thing afloat.
Yeah, it's the same old music.
True crime books. His personal investigation into his father, George Hodel, has led Steve to evidence pointing to his father as not only the murderer of the Black Dahlia, but a slew of other murderers across.
Yeah, no. None of that. George Hodel didn't kill anybody. Let's just fast forward through all of that. Okay, let's go.
The country and even the world.
Yes, George Hodel was the jet set serial killer.
We'll talk in this episode about some of the recent evidence Steve has uncovered.
Air quotes. Steve Hodel's recent evidence. Let me add that Steve's case is so crummy that he always has to find more clues and more evidence. A lot of times it deals with thought prints that sharp readers send in. He can't even exert energy to find this stuff. It's like random people send, "Hey, Steve, what about that?" "Oh, yeah. My dad did that one too." Okay.
That solidifies the case against his father.
No, it doesn't solidify anything.
As a serial killer.
No.
If you haven't done so already, go back and download the first half.
Listen to part 1, buy his books.
Of the interview from a week earlier. Things will be far clearer if you listen to them.
No, they won't. It's just this mess, this amorphous mass of Steve World. This parallel reality in which George Hodel is this serial killer and criminal genius.
That episode first. And now back with Steve Hodel. I'd like to ask you about some of the other peripheral participants in this.
Ooh. Man Ray alert! Man Ray alert! Whoop, whoop.
People that either you or others have accused of having something to do with the Black Dahlia murderers. One person that I've heard others mention is Orson Welles.
Oh dear. Okay. We're going to go into Mary Pacios, who knew Elizabeth Short when she was a girl, when Mary Pacios was a girl. And Mary Pacios came up with this theory that Orson Welles killed Elizabeth Short based on a lot of clues in movies.
Is there any evidence that points to Orson Welles having taken part in this?
Absolutely not. That's just, I mean, it's really wacko, wacko land to come
Steve Hodel being an expert on wacko land.
up with that. Orson Welles, there's nothing to. There was this woman. She claimed to be
Mary Pacios.
a friend of Elizabeth Short's from.
Her name was Mary Pacios. She lived around the corner from Elizabeth Short in Medford, and that she was a girl and knew Elizabeth Short, and that was it.
Medford, Mass. She said that Elizabeth babysat her as a child, and she became infatuated. Isn't quite the right word, but obsessed, I guess, with the investigation, and she wrote this book.
Yeah, the book is called Childhood Shadows, and it's a lot of coincidences. Of course, Steve Hodel is no stranger to coincidences in the Black Dahlia case, and if he can't find coincidences, he will manufacture them. So maybe he'll get into that. I have him on my bingo card, so we'll see.
Laying out a lot of the facts, and then she claimed that Orson Welles could well be assisting. But there's absolutely no evidence to point to Orson Welles at all.
No, there isn't. That's true.
He was a magician, and her theory is that, well, he cut women in half. Maybe he cut her in half. And,
yeah, it is pretty silly.
But it's just, it's not even worth wasting time on. There's absolutely no truth to. There's zero evidence that would link him in any way to the crime.
One of the people that you talk about extensively in your book was your father's friend, artist Man Ray.
We are going to talk about surrealism. I just got an email from a Man Ray scholar today, and he had some very interesting things to say about Steve's claims regarding Man Ray. And of course, no, he too says that Steve's full of it, like so many people. Okay, let's do Man Ray. This will be fun.
He was definitely an influence on your father. Could you explain what you think the connections are between Man Ray?
Let's see. Man Ray was the family photographer, and what Man Ray did in art, George Hodel did in reality as homage to Man Ray. Let's see if he says that Elizabeth Short posed for Man Ray, or that Man Ray introduced Elizabeth Short to George Hodel, or George Hodel introduced Elizabeth Short to Man Ray. Because none of that's true. That's just Steve World fantasy.
In the Black Dahlia murder.
Yeah, and this is a huge part of not only the L.A. lone woman murder, the Black Dahlia murder, but some of the later murders too. The crime signature of my father was.
The crime signature of his father was writing prank mail to the press, and let's see, Steve wanting it to be true. That was George Hodel's main signature, was Steve wants it to be true.
This murder is a fine art, and this was what his personal madness was. It had to do with.
Let's see, his dad hated humanity but threw big parties, right? Or something.
Surrealism, and the surrealist movement was huge movement in the 40s, earlier than that, from the 20s to the end of the 40s. And Man Ray was a surrealist, and he was living in Paris. He was born in the U.S., but he went to Paris as a young man, and then he came at the beginning of the war. He came back to and relocated to Hollywood for a decade, from 1940 to 1950.
I don't know the exact figures, but that outline is actually correct. Man Ray fled Paris ahead of the Nazis and came to Los Angeles, as so many emigres did. That's true.
And he was a surrealist painter. He was a surrealist photographer, mainly known for his photography. And the surrealists were nihilists. They were.
Yeah, I don't think Steve really knows anything about surrealism or understands it or wants to understand it. Rather than get into a discussion of what surrealism means, I'm just going to let Steve go.
antisocial to say the least. For the most part, were misogynists. Many of their artworks treat the female body as an object. Man Ray, in many of his artworks, bisected the body of women and showed them.
Yeah, I'm not sure any of that's true, but I'm not a Man Ray scholar. As I said, I did hear from a Man Ray scholar only today who corrected me on a number of things, including Man Ray's photograph of the Minotaur, Steve's famous found evidence. Okay, let's see if Steve brings up the Minotaur.
His first artworks that he did when he came to Hollywood, he has this rope tied around a woman's neck, and a suspect is dragging her down the street. Just totally misogynistic attitude towards women in general.
Again, I'm not sure that's true. I am not an expert on surrealism, and I will hold off weighing in on that, but that doesn't sound right to me.
And Dad became very close friends with Man Ray during his Hollywood years.
Okay, true fact, George Hodel and Man Ray knew each other. That is true. Whether they were close friends, that's another matter. But they did know each other. They were in contact with each other. Yeah, that's true. Yes.
They lived only a mile and a half apart. Man Ray would come on a regular basis to the house. And
you know, let me emphasize that in the Man Ray archives that are online that I've looked at, there is only a little bit about George Hodel. There were a couple letters that exchanged back and forth, mainly involving George Hodel trying to establish that a piece of artwork was indeed by Man Ray so that he could sell it for more money. We do know that. Otherwise,
parties, he and his friends.
Okay, there's no evidence of big parties, grand parties at the Sowden house. That isn't true. And let me also emphasize, because it's important, that Steve wasn't living at the Sowden house. Steve's parents, George Hodel and his mom, Dorothy, split up, and Steve and his brothers were living with the mom elsewhere. They were not living at the Sowden house, except for like emergency situations when she couldn't find a place to live. She used the house as a mail drop, but we know where she was living because she kept getting arrested for child neglect. So we have her addresses, and she wasn't living at the Sowden house. So this is all Steve fantasy. Let's see how far he goes.
Man Ray took many he was our family photographer.
You know, this Man Ray scholar I heard from today said, you know, it wasn't like Man Ray was running a little Olin Mills there in LA. He was very picky about who modeled for him. So, and this individual also has access to Man Ray's negatives. So Man Ray being the family photographer is, that's Steve World, more Steve World.
Took lots of photographs of me and my brothers and my mother and dad.
Where are they, Steve? Where are all those pictures that Man Ray allegedly took? Where are they?
And they became very close. And Dad was in awe of Man Ray and his ideas. The difference is that Man Ray displayed.
Here it comes. Here it comes.
Art, but
Dad did it in reality.
But Dad took it a step further. Dad really, and basically surrealists believed that there was no difference between the dream state and the waking state. And do what you will. You could murder, you could fly, you could do anything you want. You're unrestricted in the dream state, and that's the way it should be in life. Well,
I'm not sure the surrealists actually believe any of that, Steve. But again, I'm not an expert on surrealism, but this, I think, is going into Steve World.
Dad took it a step further, and he actually, he didn't just talk the talk like.
Oh, he walked the walk. He walked the walk.
Man Ray, he walked the walk. Ultimately, he was so enamored, and Man Ray was kind of like his guru, I guess you could say.
And Elizabeth Short was George Hodel's canvas for his homage to Man Ray.
And the Black Dahlia crime, especially, was an homage.
I told you.
And the body is posed with the arms above the head in a specific fashion. which exactly mimics a photograph Man Ray did in the 30s, which is called the Minotaur.
Yeah, let's talk about the Minotaur for a minute. Steve Hodel found this evidence by flipping through a book of Man Ray photographs and deciding, oh, that looks like Elizabeth Short. It's either a thought print or a mind fart or something like that, a blinking red light, and boom, that's it. And so that's how Detective Hodel looks for evidence. He flips through a book of photographs.
And the Minotaur, as many of your listeners probably know, was the beast in Crete in the
Yeah, okay. Minotaur was the name of a French art publication in the 1930s, and different artists did their interpretations of the Minotaur. I was told that I was mistaken. I was told that it was a cover photograph for the magazine. I am now told by this Man Ray expert that no, it was a photograph that appeared with the index. And could George Hodel have seen this photograph? Well, the original print was left in Paris when Man Ray fled to the U.S. It is possible that the magazine had some circulation in America. George Hodel was kind of an artsy individual. He might have seen it, maybe, but it was maybe. I'll put that as a maybe.
labyrinth, who devoured young maidens, was fed young maidens to keep them alive. It was this monster, half man, half beast. And the Minotaur was kind of the adopted pet, I guess you could say, of the surrealists.
It was the name of a magazine, Steve.
A lot of their works and stuff. So Dad imposing the arms above that, and that was a specific symbol, and it was readily identifiable in all surrealists. They recognized this as representing the Minotaur. So he did that, but he also bisected the body. And in the Minotaur photograph that Man Ray created,
What I am not going to cut away to the photograph here. What it shows is somebody's arms. The Minotaur was a sort of what it is somebody, Man Ray took portions of the photograph and cropped it and juxtaposed it so that it looks like an animal. That is it. That is what Steve is rambling and mumbling and about.
has a woman's body bisected at the waist. So there's that. And
Now, is he going to say that Elizabeth Short posed for this picture? Because he in one of his more recent talks, he said she posed for that picture, which of course is impossible because Man Ray took it in France in the 30s. But nothing is impossible when it comes to Steve Hodel. Nothing.
So on the body, the lips are cut ear to ear. They're actually surgically cut, and it's like a large pair of lips. He extended the mouth. And another one of Man Ray's most famous paintings is called The Lovers, and it's a pair of lips floating on the horizon from side to side. So I present my belief that he extended
my deeply held wish that my dad somehow saw this stuff and it turned him into a maniacal killer. But he was already a maniacal killer. Yeah.
This to include the lovers, Man Ray's lovers. So you've got both paintings. And as I write in my book, I indicate that Dad used his paintbrush. Dad's paintbrush was a scalpel, and her body was his canvas. So he was actually. These are taunts, and this, only to be read by the initiated surrealists, who left a lot of clues in their paintings in different ways.
Yeah, Steve likes to find clues in paintings. Especially, he will find the name Hodel everywhere. You can go back, and I've done it. It's kind of fun to take the Mona Lisa and find it using his technique, using Hodel. I mean, it's if you know how he does it, it's practically in every painting ever done, except for maybe even Mark Rothko. If you took a Mark Rothko painting, Steve could probably find a Hodel in it somewhere, because he's so arbitrary about it.
Word games and stuff. So there are those two, And then it wouldn't be until my second book that I discovered a major new discovery, which is actually a third link to Man Ray.
Is this a blinking red light? Is it a thought print?
Which is a painting called L'Equivoque, which Man Ray did in 1943. And amazingly, it looks like the evidence is fairly compelling that the model for this was actually Elizabeth Short.
That, Steve-O, is utter fucking bullshit. And here's why. There's no connection between Elizabeth Short and Man Ray. She was only in LA for a couple of weeks with her dad in 43, and then took off for Vandenberg, what's now at Vandenberg Air Force Base, and was at the time Camp Cook. So this is absolutely ridiculous. No. This is Steve World fantasy. Didn't happen.
I know that's hard to believe, but...
Yeah, it's really hard to believe, Steve. Impossible, in fact.
We know she was out here during that time.
Very briefly.
And we have documentation that she was posing for paintings.
No, we don't. Are we good? Oh. After Elizabeth Short was killed, all kinds of scammers surfaced. And there was a guy who was, if I recall correctly, he was living in Arizona. And he said that, Elizabeth Short posed for me when I was living in Arizona. And there's zero connection between Elizabeth Short and this guy. This didn't happen. But the Herald Express, I think it was in the Herald Express, loved to write about Black Dahlia stories, and anybody with the most marginal connection could wander into the Herald Examiner newsroom or the Herald Express newsroom and get a story. It was easy. And so I think that's what happened. But the guy was a total BS artist.
From different artists in 1944 in Hollywood.
No, she wasn't in Hollywood in 44, you dummy.
We have the name of the artist, and he painted to...
Do you have where she was living in Los Angeles in 1944? No, because she wasn't in Los Angeles in 1944. What a liar you are, Steve. How are you ever a cop? How?
2 different oil paintings of her. Well, it's my belief that...
my hope...
In 1943, either George, my father, introduced Elizabeth...
No, don't say this. No.
...to Man Ray, or Man Ray introduced Elizabeth to George. Either way...
No, that has no basis in reality whatsoever. That did not happen. Only in the parallel universe of Steve World did any of this stuff occur. It's crazy.
It looks like she posed for this painting that Man Ray did called L'Equivoque. And the painting has a very strange geometrical figure on the face. The hair is exactly in the style of Elizabeth Short, which is quite unique. You have to see the actual painting, which is in my second book, to see the similarity, but it's identical to how Elizabeth Short was wearing her hair.
No.
But instead of a regular face, he has this strange geometrical crisscross pattern, very distinctive.
Yeah, let me point out that cross-hatching is an art technique that goes back many centuries. It isn't new. It wasn't just invented. And Steve depends on the absolute ignorance of the people who are listening to him to fall for this crazy stuff. No.
Well, George Hodel on the right hip of Elizabeth Short's body mimics and copies this same pattern, geometrical pattern, carves it into her right hip. Again, another taunt, and
that's not at all. Nope.
Catch me if you can figure this out. But clearly, I mean, that was a huge link because it's such a unique.
It's a huge link in the mind of Steve Hodel, if not in reality.
Geometrical shape. It's not like it's just, it's not. I mean, it's exact in its duplication. And there are a bunch of others we probably don't have time to go into, but there's a bunch of other linkage in some of the mailings. He makes reference. He sends in a picture, a photograph, with a stocking mask over this man's face and says, "This is the killer. I saw him kill her."
I'm not sure about that, but I want to emphasize, I want to underscore that all the stuff that was mailed to the newspapers and the police during the Black Dahlia case, only the original envelope with her property in it from her purse was considered legit. All the rest were pranks and crackpots. There were a few people who were operating out, in good conscience and good faith. They thought, hey, I saw something or whatever. But pranking the police, pranking the newspapers was a thing to do in LA in the 40s. It was common, believe it or not. And not every crackpot letter was from George Hodel. And we'll see if Steve recognizes his dad's handwriting, because that's one of Steve Hodel's favorite tools. You know your dad's handwriting. I know my dad's handwriting. Okay.
Well, Man Ray in 45 put a stocking mask over Julia, his wife's face, as one of his paintings. So again, it's another copy and another reference to Man Ray. And just on and on. There's
nobody ever put stockings over somebody's head except for Man Ray. That never happened, right? No one had ever done that before or since. Man Ray invented it. Is that what you're saying, Detective Hodel?
In my second book, I go into what I call the Man Ray nexus, which has about 9 different links. And all of this comes back to this theme of murder as a fine art, which was Dad's crime signature theme for this and for many of his other crimes too. And
it's a signature that only Steve Hodel can recognize. The uninitiated are oblivious, but Steve, of course, recognizes thought prints and mind farts right away.
It was part of his personal madness, and it relates to surrealism.
So let's go through some of the evidence you found linking your dad to the murder.
Oh, yeah.
I have to ask about the cement bags.
Yes. So I completed my first book, and it came out in 03. Then I had to update it with a new chapter with new evidence in 04.
Steve is always finding new evidence. He'll come out with new books and new updates and different editions and stuff like that. Steve, some part of him knows that his case is so crummy that he has to constantly find new evidence. Steve Hodel has spent the last 20 years finding new evidence.
And then again, new evidence came out in 06. And then I just kept on going. So
kept on finding more evidence, more clues.
Basically, the first book covers from basically 03 to 06. And then in my second book, I pick up and it covers from 06 to 2014 with lots of new evidence and connections. Basically, I learned that there's a file at UCLA Archives, Special Collections, on Lloyd Wright.
Now that's interesting. Steve actually got something right. Usually he calls him Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. It's Lloyd Wright.
House that Dad bought was built by...
Okay, no. George Hodel never bought the Franklin house, the Sowden house. He never owned that. It was owned by Steve's grandfather, George Hodel Sr. It was a rental. It had been a rental for years. If you go back and look at the history of that house, all kinds of people had been in and out of there. And when George Hodel came back from China, where he was for a good chunk of 1946, important, 1946, when he came back from China, he rented the house and he rented out rooms to other people. He was trying to get a little artsy colony going. So that was what was really happening. Lloyd Wright did, I think what Steve is talking about is the Lloyd Wright archives at UCLA. It isn't that, oh, they had a file on Lloyd Wright. The Lloyd Wright archives are at UCLA because he was a well-known architect.
Frank Lloyd Wright Jr.
No, Lloyd Wright, not Frank Lloyd Wright Jr. Jeez, how were you ever a cop?
Son of Frank, the famous architect. And Lloyd Wright became a major architect in his own right. And he was the son of Frank Lloyd Wright. And he built this Mayan temple in 1926. He designed and built are what I call in my book the Franklin House. It's actually known as the Soden House, built originally for John Soden by Lloyd Wright in 26. So Dad buys the house in 4.
He didn't buy the house. He rented it from your grandfather, Steve. You're such a liar. And let me emphasize that the Soden House, as you see it today, is after a more than $1 million renovation. In the 1940s, it was this goofy white elephant of a house in Hollywood. That's the real story. It was a rental. They had all kinds of people in and out of there. It was just this weird old house.
45, and we move in and live there from 45 to 1950 when Dad.
Now that's a total lie. That is a total lie. We did not live at the Soden House, Steve Hodel. Your folks split up. You and your mom were bouncing. You and your mom and your brothers were bouncing all over LA. You did not live continuously at the Soden House. That is a fucking lie. Didn't happen.
Flees the country.
I didn't flee the country. We'll get. Did we get? I don't know if he's going to get into that. What happened is, he was accused of molesting Tamar. Didn't happen. He was found not guilty, but Tamar succeeded in her goal of trashing his reputation. George Hodel could not get hired anywhere in the continental United States. The closest job he could get was in Hawaii. And so he went to Hawaii. He didn't flee the country, because let me point out that Hawaii was an American territory. He couldn't get a job. Tamar trashed his reputation, even though he was found not guilty. She succeeded.
Anyway, I discovered that Lloyd Wright had a file at UCLA.
He has archives at UCLA, Steve. They are called archives. If you were any sort of researcher, you would know that.
I went through it, and much to my amazement, I discovered there's a George Hodel file within the Lloyd Wright file.
There is correspondence between Lloyd Wright and George Hodel. I have it, as a matter of fact. Some of it is, and I doubt that Steve will tell you this, some of it is when George Hodel is in China, because did I mention that George Hodel was in China for a bunch of 1946? Oh, oops. I don't think Steve is going to tell you that somehow.
And I'm going through it, and here are original. I discovered that my father communicated, had letters in there with Lloyd Wright.
Yeah, from China?
And basically, Lloyd Wright took over some of the renovation of the house. It was going into some disrepair.
Yeah, it was this funky old house that was a rental that was owned by George Hodel Sr., Steve's grandfather.
And Dad wanted work repaired. And Dad at that point left in 46. He went to China for.
There you go. You got a little truth in there. Yeah, George Hodel went to China.
Just under a year. And during that period, he hired Lloyd Wright to do the repairs and stuff. And he came back in September, October of 46. And
now that's an important fact, because it shows there was a minimal overlap between Elizabeth Short and George Hodel. George Hodel comes back to LA about the last quarter. I forget the exact date when he came back. I think it's September. But anyway, he comes back to Los Angeles, September, October of 46. And Elizabeth Short goes down to San Diego in December of 46. So there's about a 2 or 2.5 month overlap when they could have even encountered each other. That is the reality.
Elizabeth, of course, was killed just a few months later. But getting back to the bag, so I'm going through there and I look, and there are receipts for some cement, some 50-pound cement bags.
Oh my God, cement bags! Whoa!
The house was all concrete, so cement was the major part of it. And I see that there were 10 bags of 50-pound bags of cement.
That letter does talk about bags of cement. Yeah, it does.
But amazingly, the bags the receipt is dated on the 8th and 9th of January, 1947. The work was completed. and billed to George Hodel through Lloyd Wright. And these 50-pound bags of cement were the same size and type used to transport Elizabeth Short's body from an unknown murder location to the crime scene.
Now, you know, what's amazing, in the city the size of Los Angeles, that George Hodel was the only person using bags of cement. Isn't that amazing? All the post-war construction, nobody was using cement. George Hodel had a corner on the market. No cement for you today, Joe. George Hodel has it all.
The dump site. And LAPD confirmed this, that these bags at the dump site were the bags used to transport her body from somewhere else. They had blood on them, they had water on them, and
yeah, I'm not sure just exactly if that's true. The newspapers reported that there were cement bags found at the crime scene. And I'm not going to get into any more about the cement bags, except because I don't want to go on, I don't want to do a video. I don't want to say in a video any more about that. But yeah, that's what the newspaper said, they were cement bags. But they could have been from anywhere. You know, a lot of construction going on in LA.
The suspect apparently put the body parts on top of these, not inside, but on top of these bags, and then probably covered on top of that, transported to the location, and then used them to carry it to the sidewalk, to the vacant lot, pose them. And then the bags he just left laying next to the body. Well, in the original crime scene photographs, you see these 50-pound large paper bags by the body.
Yeah, sort of, not really. If you study the photographs, you may see something. You may see bags. I'll leave it at that.
So we've got the receipt. Amazingly, we've got the receipt for these. I mean, how many killers are walking around with 50-pound bags of cement in their back pocket, you know?
How many people in LA were using cement in 1947? Come on, Steve. That's just the most ridiculous line of reasoning.
So we've got these bags with the date within that so-called missing week, but within days of her being placed there, we've got these bags placed at the Franklin house, known to be at the Franklin house. So that's hard physical evidence connecting it to the crime. I don't have the serial numbers, but hey, you know.
But hey, I want it to be true. Isn't that good enough?
And there was not just cement. There was also a bag of steer manure. One of the bags was steer manure, Bandini steer manure. And Dad also had, in these receipts in the file, Lloyd Wright's file, also contained a purchase of planting. It didn't specify Bandini, but it said several $100s worth of plantings and materials. So there were a lot of plantings around the property and landscaping. So
yeah, and there's nothing about that steer manure in the receipt, I don't believe. I mean, I have copies of this stuff. I haven't referred to it in a while. As I said, I do this cold. I haven't listened to it ahead of time, but I don't remember it mentioning that at all. I think that's just Steve wishing something into existence, as he so often does.
What's interesting is that it's my belief that
God, I want this to be true. Oh, please, please let it be true.
Feces that was found in the stomach, which she was force-fed feces, is most likely this steer manure.
Oh, come on. Come on, Steve. No. No. Okay. Let's talk reality for a minute. The feces in Elizabeth Short's stomach and being forced to eat feces, that's John Gilmore bullshit. Fecal material was found in her stomach. The way it was explained to me is it's the normal digestion process, or possibly backflow from her being cut in half. That's where it really is. John Gilmore is the first one to say, oh yeah, she was forced to eat feces. So, and was steered. I really think that the medical examiner could distinguish between, human and steer manure. Come on, Steve. It's just, where does he get this stuff? It's just so crazy. I never know what Steve is going to say. He always surprises me with some weird thing he says. Okay.
Of course, feces. And the reason I say that is the bags.
The reason I say that is because I want it to be true. That's why I want it to be true. Therefore, it's true. Welcome to the world of Steve Hodel.
It was called fertilite, steer manure fertilite. Well, that fertilite was a green substance mixed in with the steer manure. And in the autopsy report, they talk about a green substance, unidentified substance found in the stomach along with the feces.
Maybe it was green peas. Maybe it was a salad.
So had they known, they could have certainly tested and identified.
Pretty sure the medical examiner looked at all that stuff. It was pretty routine. How was Steve Hodel ever a cop? How was he ever a cop? How?
Identified it as being fertilite, but of course, I guess they didn't put that.
They wouldn't have known that. They were so dumb. These guys weren't dumb. The medical examiner wasn't dumb. The crime lab wasn't dumb. These guys were smart. They had done a lot of, the crime lab had done a lot of analysis. The medical examiner had done lots and lots of autopsies. They knew their stuff. This is just Steve Hodel stumble bumming through it and hoping it's true.
Together back then. But that was an amazing link that, it just, doors keep opening one after the.
Is that a door, really? Wanting it to be true?
The other on this investigation, even to the present time.
Another piece of evidence was the wristwatch found.
Oh, I love the story about the wristwatch. Okay, here's what really happened with Steve Hodel's beloved wristwatch. Okay, Elizabeth Short is found on Norton Avenue, sort of midway on the block. The police did all kinds of sweeps and stuff. There's a park about maybe a block and a half away, a couple hundred yards, we'll say. And a young boy, I think he was about 14, is like doing junior Crime Stopping, and he finds this watch. It's a Croton wristwatch. And, he shows it to the cops. It's an old wristwatch. It's rusty and stuff like that. And the cops go, nah, that's not important. And Steve has taken that story, that incident, and he has implied that the watch was at the crime scene. He has even implied that the watch was in Elizabeth Short's body. No, it was several hundred yards away at this little park that's down the street. That is the reality. And Steve will even go, I think, to a photograph of his dad, and it's like, oh, here's my dad wearing the watch. Okay, if that is the story that Steve's going to tell, it is utter bullshit from start to finish.
At the crime scene.
Yeah, the wristwatch, I'm a little bit off of that in the sense that.
As well you should be.
I'm not as, it's possible. What's interesting is, I saw a movie called Blow Up. Some of you may be familiar with it, which was a kind of a classic film. And it gave me, it's a story of, it's a murder mystery, English murder mystery. And in it, the photographer was out taking photographs in the park, and he captures what may have been a murder in progress. And he starts blowing up the photographs he's taken, and they become evidence in this crime.
Oh, is he talking about Blow Up? Is that what he said? Oh yeah, famous movie. Really good. Has nothing to do. Okay.
He's actually able to connect the killer to the photographs he was taking. Well, that kind of gave me the idea to take the original crime scene photographs, of which I had pristine copies of and blow them up, enlarge them to see if I could kind of do a re-walk through of the original crime scene. I did that, and one of the things
Steve Hodel laughs at the weirdest times. Why is that funny? Why is he laughing? It's weird. In the first part, he was laughing about Russian persecution of Jews. I mean, what's the deal? I don't get it.
Discovered was there was an object, man-made object, inside the body, in the torso, that looked like.
No. He's going to go for George Hodel left his wristwatch in the body, and that sure as hell did not happen. That watch was found hundreds of yards away by a teenager playing junior detective.
A watch. It was round, circular, and it was actually inside the body of the upper.
No, that did not happen at all.
Portion of the torso. And when I compared that to the photographs at the coroner's office, the object was not there. So I assumed
the object was never there because the object didn't exist. No watch was found in her body, Steve. That's a fantasy.
They had taken whatever this object was out and just not mentioned it, or it never came up.
Yeah, as so often happens in autopsies and murder investigations, it's just, oh, we're going to pull this out and not mention it. Yeah, sure. Were you ever at a crime scene, Steve? Because I'm not confident.
But then I discover in researching articles that they actually found a man's wristwatch. They had 60 or so police cadets from LAPD do a walkthrough of the vacant lot and area.
That's not true either. They did a number of walkthroughs of that area. They had guys, if I remember that part of the story correctly, they had actual police officers walk shoulder to shoulder. It wasn't cadets. Cadets wouldn't be trusted with that stuff. And this young man who found the wristwatch, he was just a junior crime stopper. He had no affiliation with law enforcement at all. He was just a good citizen trying to help. And there were people trying to help the investigation. That happened.
And they recovered a men's watch, a military watch, which they describe as being found near the body.
No, it was found hundreds of yards away. It was a Croton watch.
In the area there. And that led me to believe that there's very possible that this, because in many of the surrealist work.
That led me to believe, oh, please, please, please let it be Dad's watch. Please let it be Dad's watch. This is just all fantasy. This is all just made up out of thin air. All of it.
They will place a timepiece, a watch. You're familiar with the Dahlia melting watches.
Right.
They will use it, and there are lots of other examples of it in surrealist art, where they actually use that.
Oh, those surrealists.
To represent time in their artworks. So this led me to believe that Dad actually placed this watch inside the body again as part of his.
That doesn't make any sense at all. Zero logic.
His masterpiece, his surrealist masterpiece. And then it either just fell out and was found a few days later in the area, or whatever. Sadly, all the, and I thought this would be a slam dunk. We'd look at the watch that's in evidence, and it either was or wasn't. I had photos of Dad, pictures of Dad wearing a watch, a military watch with a black face in the 40s. So I thought, well, we'll compare it and see if it matches. But unfortunately, that's another part of we may or not have time to get into, which is all of the evidence, the physical evidence has disappeared from.
Yeah, let's talk about the physical evidence from the Black Dahlia, because there isn't any. There's really nothing to disappear. She was found naked. They don't know, they don't know what happened to any of her stuff. A few things were mailed to the police and to the newspapers and the police, items from her purse. They analyzed that stuff. But beyond that, there was nothing to disappear. There was her luggage. That's not really evidence. So There really isn't any evidence to disappear. And this fantasy watch that Steve is talking about, it was unrelated to the crime. The original newspapers say, yeah, this kid showed this old watch to the detectives, and they went, oh yeah, cool kid, and that was the end of it. There is no evidence like that.
LAPD property and files, it's all vanished. But at the time, I didn't know that, and I thought, well, we'll just compare it, and
No.
it is or it isn't. But it certainly is interesting, and unfortunately, when blowing it up, you can only see the fact that it appears to be man.
No, that's Steve fantasy. There is nothing like that. Those guys studied the body carefully. Didn't happen. Steve fantasy.
Made, and it's not that distinctive because when you blow it up, it loses its fidelity.
And some of the most damning evidence you found was from a set of police transcripts. And these transcripts pretty much.
Oh, I love talking about the police transcripts. Steve loves to distort them and make them into things that they aren't. Yeah, he's really good at that.
Prove that your father was a murderer.
No, they don't prove that at all. They prove nothing like that.
Yes, basically the real icing on the cake, let's say, to the investigatively speaking, came out after my book was published, and that has to do, and I think it's worth discussing this aspect, which has to do with the DA transcripts. And
okay, let me point out again for the the umpteenth time, before Steve wrote his book, he never asked to see the LAPD file on his dad. He never asked to see it. They would have showed it to him. I have been told by robbery homicide detectives, yeah, if Steve Hodel had come to me and said, hey, out of professional courtesy, would you show me my dad's file in the Black Dahlia case? They said, yeah, I would have showed it to him. After the book comes out where he accuses the LAPD of cover-up and incompetence and all that stuff, there's no way. He will never see the LAPD file on his dad. He will never, ever see it. What Steve is talking about here, and I don't know how he is going to produce it, position it to make it sound more incriminating than it was. What really happened is George Hodel was under surveillance for 5.5 weeks. And they got bored. They said, this is dull. There's nothing going on. And they pulled out and went away. They said, there's nothing here. And the final district attorney's report says everything tends to eliminate the suspect. But you might wonder, why is the district attorney even looking at the Black Dahlia case? Okay, here's why. A couple of years later, there was a rogue investigation within the LAPD by a guy named Paul DeRiver, and he conned the Metro Squad, the gangster squad, into doing this parallel investigation. He didn't tell the homicide division, he didn't tell the head of homicide or the lead detectives that he was going to do this, he just did it. And long story short, it was a disaster. It blew up in their face. And so what happened was there was so much fallout from this disaster that the Los Angeles County Grand Jury investigated this mess. And they did a little investigation with the LAPD handling of the Black Dahlia case. As far as the district attorney's office was concerned, the LAPD had done a good job investigating the Black Dahlia case. Steve will tell you, oh, everybody was corrupt. No. It was a state-of-the-art investigation for 1947. Anyway, George Hodel was under surveillance for 5.5 weeks, and the transcripts are out of that. Now, what you need to remember is that Steve will distort these things tremendously. At one point, a technician says, I'm having trouble with the equipment. And Steve says, oh, he changes that to say, George Hodel says, I'm in trouble. Now, that's not at all what happened. It's just Steve wanting it to be true. Okay, Larry rant over. Chronic naysayer hits the play button again.
All of that, because Steve Hodel could sit here for 5 hours and tell you all the reasons why the case is solved, but it's still.
He will. He certainly will.
Steve Hodel saying it. So much to my amazement, and what happened was, after my book came out, or just as it was coming out, I went to one of the LA Times reporters. He's a columnist named Steve Lopez, who's fairly well known.
Yeah, what really happened is Steve Hodel went to one of Steve Lopez's readings and said, "Hey, I got a book coming out. Are you interested?" And Steve Lopez said, "Yeah." So Steve Hodel gives Lopez a copy of the book. Lopez gives it to me to say, "Hey, what do you think?" And I tell him what I think, which is it's bullshit. And so that was how that happened. But I need to tell you that Steve Hodel and his publicist wanted to make absolutely sure there was one person at the LA Times who did not see his book ahead of time, and that was me. So that's kind of where Steve Hodel was coming from. The entire book was written in secret. He didn't tell anybody he was working on. He didn't contact the LAPD. He didn't tell his family. Everybody was pretty surprised when the book came out about some of the things that were in it.
Here in LA and throughout the nation. And he's kind of a watchdog kind of guy, and I thought, of all the people, he would be a good one to give this to as kind of an exclusive before the book comes out. So I went to him and gave him the book ahead of time and kind of gave him a summary. He interviewed me at length.
This is the exact copy that Steve Hodel gave to Steve Lopez to write about. It's got Steve Lopez's annotations in it. It has my annotations in it. I now have this. I got it, Steve. It's still bullshit. Just as it was in 2003. Still bullshit.
And then he went to, and this is before the book came out, just literally days before. He goes to LAPD and he says, "Hey, there's this guy, Steve Hodel, retired LAPD. Yada, yada." He says his father was the Black Dahlia killer, blah, blah, blah. And basically, LA said, go away. We don't discuss this. This is an active case. Of course, it's not an active.
No, it is open. It is not active. Again, if Steve Hodel had gone to the LAPD and asked to see his file, his dad's file, they would have given it to him. He didn't do that. He never did that before the book came out. Now he'll never see it.
Case. They haven't done anything with it for years, but they just basically.
That isn't true either. Not true.
Said, we're not talking to you. So Lopez then goes to the DA and basically says, "Hey, Hodel, yada, there's this." And, Steve Cooley was the DA at that time. And Cooley says to him, "Well, I'm not spending a dime of taxpayers' money to reinvestigate an old case." But he says, "But there is a file on the Black Dahlia if you want. It's locked away in the vault if you want to see it." Lopez says, "Sure."
Okay, again, that is from the grand jury investigation into what was the Leslie Dillon debacle. Okay, that's what the grand jury was investigating. And Steve will say, "Oh, it's secret." Yeah, grand jury proceedings are always secret. That's how they are.
So they go downstairs, open the vault, get the box out. He gives it to Lopez. Lopez goes up to a room.
I don't think that's how it was either. That was most likely handled through the Public Information Office. And the Black Dahlia files were actually a couple of boxes, not one. It was 2 and like a half boxes of material.
Sits down, opens up the file, and out falls a picture of Dr. George Hill Odell. He says, "Whoa, apparently he was a suspect." So Lopez spends, a couple of hours going through, and he discovers some transcripts. He discovers the fact that the Franklin house, the Mayan temple that we lived in, was bugged by LA.
Yeah, but Steve wasn't living there. If you look at the transcripts, they will tell you who was living there when the house was bugged. And you know who's not there? Dorothy Hodel isn't there. You know who else isn't there? Steve and his 2 brothers. They aren't living there.
The PD and the DA's office on an investigation back then in 1950, January. and then he discovers some very damning transcripts.
Well, Steve wants it to be damning. They're boring. They're dull. George Hodel was a smart guy. He knew the house was bugged. At one point, he says, I think in a telephone conversation, don't say anything on the telephone, it's bugged. He knew. George Hodel was a smart guy. No question about it.
They're actually, transcripts from the taped. It was actually a wire recorder, but
there you go. You actually got it right. Wow, amazing.
Recorded, where Dad actually confesses to the crime.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't.
So he writes a couple of articles, very quick, cursory articles on, well, Hodel was a suspect and da-da-da.
And Larry Harnisch says it's the equivalent of seeing the face of Jesus on a tortilla. Steve likes to forget that quote, but I am in that column saying that. And I'll still say that. Not true.
He makes these statements and stuff, and he kind of leaves it at that. And so then I go down to the DA and I said, can I make copies and look through it? And he says, yes. So I copy, about 300 or 400 pages of documents, and I spend the next 6 months going through them.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of paper. I should say more about the district attorney's files. The district attorney was doing a records purge in order to make room. And somebody said, hey, let's get rid of this old paperwork, but no. The Black Dahlia stuff looks important. So they shoveled it into boxes. It's just random. It was a mess. It was like somebody had taken a lot of paper and just scooped a lot of paper into a box and shaken it like that. That's what it's like. There's no order to it at all. In fact, the George Hodel transcripts were split in half. One half was in one box, and I think the other half was in the other box, but they weren't together. That's for sure. Because I was there. I also went through everything.
And it's incredible what I find.
It's boring. Believe me, it's boring. You have the technicians saying things like, Hodel is listening to Japanese music. It's worse than the Mexican music. They will say, well, Hodel is in the bathroom. Ye gods, what a blast. Stuff like that. I mean, it's dull. It is very, very dull. George Hodel types a lot. There's a lot of typing. And he plays music loud. He knew that he was being bugged.
Dad was the prime suspect back then.
No, he was never the prime suspect. Was he a suspect? Yeah. Was he the prime suspect? No, never.
By LAPD.
No.
And I'm reading through the transcripts, and I'll read you a couple of the quotes that are actually from the tape recorded stuff that files.
Yeah, wire recorder. And remember, Steve manipulates these quotes tremendously. Okay.
They locked away, and it starts out by Dad saying, and these are actual live conversations. They're not phone taps. A lot of people think they're the phone. They're not. They're actually, what they did was, they picked up Dad, took him downtown to the Hall of Justice to question him back then. And while they have him in custody down there talking to him, a couple of sound technicians from LAPD and the DA's office go out to our house, break in.
It wasn't your house. You weren't living there, Steve. But they did put microphones in the house. That part is true. Now, if you read the transcripts, and I have them all online, you will see that they say we had a lot of problems with the equipment. They had just installed it. There was a lot of what they call crosstalk and noise. Conversations were hard to make out. Steve isn't going to tell you any of that. Steve isn't going to tell you that they had trouble with the equipment. He isn't going to tell you that they had difficulty picking up conversations. No. He's going to make it sound like it was all sound studio perfection, which it was not.
Insert hard microphones in the walls, in the living room and in the bedroom. Run a
bathroom. There was a microphone in the bathroom. They talk about bathroom a lot.
Hardwire to the basement. Run that to the Pactel lines, telephone lines. Run that to Hollywood detectives 2 miles away into the basement, and they have 18 detectives assigned to a task force 24/7 for
I don't think it was that many, but whatever.
the next 42 days. And
5.5 weeks.
and they're tape recording 24/7 around the clock.
Wire recording. Wire, wire, wire.
2 detectives sitting in there listening to these conversations and recording when necessary. Here's a couple of the verbatim statements from the actual transcripts. We hear Dad say, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." Well, his secretary was Ruth Spalding, and
That's true. As a matter of fact, I was the one to identify George Hodel's secretary. You're welcome. And Steve is going to say that he killed her. Probably. He likes to say that. She committed suicide. And Steve has come up with, in his play, and yeah, he's written a play about his dad. He'll say, yeah, my dad forced her to commit suicide, or he put sleeping pills in her orange juice or something like that. The reality is that to commit suicide with barbiturates that she did, you need to take a lot of them and you need to drink them with alcohol. That's how it was done. So no, you can't force somebody to commit suicide. That's ridiculous. Let's see if Steve says any of that. It's his usual song and dance. We'll see.
he was investigated 18 months before the.
No, that's total bullshit. Her death was investigated. It was determined to be a suicide. He was never a suspect. No one was ever a suspect. Suicide. As inconvenient a fact that is for Steve, she committed suicide. Nobody was ever a suspect. That is a total lie.
Dahlia murder as a murder suspect.
No.
They believe that he overdosed his secretary.
No, they don't believe that. You can't do that. That's impossible.
Because she was going to reveal some.
Oh yeah. Billing irregularities. This is all a lie. All of this, all of what Steve is now saying is a lie. The guy lies all the time about everything.
Criminal activity or some kind of information. Anyway, ultimately, LAPD acknowledged they did investigate him as a murder suspect.
No, they didn't. That is utter bullshit, Steve. Total lie. Every word of that's a lie.
But they weren't able to prove anything, so it was listed as a suicide. Anyway,
because it was a suicide. It's on her death certificate. Suicide.
later, another conversation. FBI were over to see me 3 weeks ago. Another conversation. Well, anyway, she hasn't said that she committed incest or killed the Black Dahlia. And he goes,
what's he talking about? What? How is it pertinent that the FBI came to see him? I'm not sure that, I haven't looked at the transcripts in a long time. I'm not sure that's in there.
Goes on to say, don't say anything on the phone.
Yeah, because it's bugged. He wasn't stupid.
It's tapped.
Yeah.
I have your phone number. I'll have to go out and call you. Well, so he's guessing.
Yeah, he knew he was bugged. Thank you for proving my point that George Hodel knew he was bugged, and therefore everything he said was playing to the microphones because he knew they were listening. That's why he says, hey, I know where there's a furniture store where if you're in law enforcement, you can get a really good deal on furniture or on clothing, stuff like that. He knew from day one.
Or he's thinking that his phone is tapped, but he doesn't have a clue that he's wired for sound. And then he goes on, they're probably watching me. Do you think we could get some girls in to find out what they're doing? And then he actually cops out to the murder of his secretary. He says, put a pillow over her head, covered her with a blanket, got a taxi, called Georgia Street Receiving Hospital, expired at 12:39. They thought there was something fishy.
No, that's not true. She was taken to Georgia Street Receiving Hospital. That part is true. The rest of it, It seems to me he would have called an ambulance rather than a taxi cab. But I haven't looked at that information in a while. I don't have it off. I don't have it off the top of my head.
Anyway, now they may have figured it out, killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary.
I'm not sure that's in there. I'd have to check. But Steve lies so much, I'm very skeptical of anything he says.
And then he goes on to say in another conversation, this is the best payoff I've seen between law enforcement agencies.
Yeah, he was baiting the cops. Now, somewhere along the line, Steve will say there was a murder on these recordings. There was guys go downstairs. There's a pipe being hit. A woman screams and whatnot. And why didn't the cops do something? That's generally how his story goes. He hasn't gotten there yet, so I'm wondering if he just hasn't gotten to that part of the story yet. But he loves that part of the story.
You don't have the right contacts made at the DA's office, and on and on. So, and then he talks about performing abortions.
Not only did he not do abortions, he was opposed to abortion. That is the reality.
Which is a whole other section in my book about there was an abortion ring by medical doctors paying protection money so they wouldn't be arrested.
Yeah, Steve Hodel will accuse a certain doctor of being the head of an abortion ring, and in fact, that doctor was dead by the time that supposedly happened. Hard to run an abortion ring if you're dead, but in Steve world, that's possible.
Abortion back then was a felony. You went to state prison for 3 to 5 years if you were caught performing an abortion. And so you've got all of these tapes now. They're on about the 42nd
wire recordings, wire.
The day of the tape recordings, and Dad apparently is tipped off. He splits, leaves the country, literally leaving the detectives with their microphones up their walls, and they close it down.
That isn't what happened at all. George Hodel continued to live in the house. The detectives gave up and presumably abandoned the microphones in the house. But George Hodel didn't suddenly flee the country. Steve likes to have people flee the country just ahead of the law. But you know what? That didn't happen. And the reason we know that didn't happen is because he was there for a while. He was there for a while. It took him a while to get a job in Hawaii because nobody would hire him after Tamar trashed his reputation, even though he was found not guilty. And that's the real story.
But probably the most damning thing of all is on the third day of the tape recordings, and this is the reason,
Oh, here it comes. They go downstairs. A pipe is hit. A woman screams.
You say, your listeners will say, well, what the heck? They had him dead bang. Why didn't they?
Why weren't they out of Hollywood Station?
Prosecute. Why wasn't he arrested? Well, he was about to be arrested, but he split and fled the country.
He didn't flee the country, and no. That isn't how it happened at all. Now, is he not going to tell the story about the woman screaming? I missed that. Oh, come on, Steve.
What about extradition? Was there any attempt to extradite him back to the U.S.?
No, and that's what.
No, they didn't want to extradite him because he didn't do anything. Steve?
You have to understand.
I guess we're not going to get the woman screaming story. Oh, I'm so disappointed, Steve. How could you leave that out? It's your favorite part. It's my favorite part.
And the history of LA and what was happening at that very moment to understand why they did what they did, which was basically, I call it a Dahlia gate, where it was actually a cover-up. And there's no question that they did what they did because we have the tapes and we have the transcripts, and none of this ever came out back then. So he split and basically.
I would have to look up and see when he left the country, but it wasn't right. He didn't. he didn't take off while he was still under surveillance. That didn't happen. They gave up and said, the end of the transcripts is, we're done, goodbye. And that's what really happened.
What happens is, at the very time these tape recordings are being made, Bill Parker, who was our most famous police chief, back then was about to take command. He was literally 2 months away from becoming the next chief. He and Thad Brown, the chief of detectives, were vying for the position of chief.
That's actually true. That was actually true. Steve is not going to tell you the backstory, though. The LAPD had a big problem with job selling in the 1930s. One of many things that was problematic within the LAPD. There was a recall in 1938, a new mayor, Fletcher Bowron, and a new police chief, Arthur Homan. Arthur Homan was, in some ways, a reformed police chief. He instituted a lot of steps that he made the LAPD less, more professional in the sense that he changed the badge design, the current design of the badge, because they used to hand out badges to everybody. Arthur Homan changed the badge design, and the LAPD is now very, very strict about the current badge design. That's from the reform era. Another thing that Arthur Homan do, he says, you know what, we're not going to use the LAPD as strike breakers anymore. We're not going to do that, because that's what used to happen. Anyway, Homan stepped down, and Clemens Horrell became police chief. And Clemens Horrell was the World War II police chief. And he stepped down in the late 40s, and they had a Marine general for 1 year, William Wharton, and he was going to clean up things. He was going to investigate. They brought in somebody from the outside. Wharton investigated various departments within the police, and he said, you know what? It's basically a good department. There are a few bad actors, but generally it's okay. So after a year, there's a competition for police chief between William Parker and Thad Brown. Both popular guys. Thad Brown had his contingent for sure, and so did Parker. And Parker ended up becoming chief. And when Parker keeled over and died, Thad Brown then became acting chief. And that's what happens. Now, the disgrace to all of this is that Steve Hodel will go on and on about how Thad Brown was on the take and corrupt and covered up the Black Dahlia case and on, which is totally wrong. None of that's true. It is really, really a disservice to the family of Thad Brown, the way Steve Hodel has accused him of all this misconduct. Anyway, so here we go into the Parker years.
And they both kind of had their long knives out for each other. So this breaks, and I think what happened was that internal affairs are...
what I want to have happened is...
detectives from robbery, homicide, whatever.
Okay. Oh, come on, Steve. Robbery and homicide were separate divisions at that time. They hadn't been joined yet. Ah, God, how were you ever a cop?
Go to Parker and Brown, and they say, hey, we've got this doctor. It looks like we have him on the Black Dahlia murder and probably some other murders he committed, but he split the country.
No, that didn't happen. None of that happened. George Hodel was under surveillance for 5.5 weeks and eliminated. The police took their equipment and went away. And then George Hodel couldn't get a job anywhere closer than Hawaii. That's the real story.
And we don't know where he is. We don't know if he's in Mexico or he went to Asia or whatever. And
none of that's true. That's all fantasy. That is all Steve World fantasy.
I think what happened was Thad Brown, chief of detectives, who was in charge of all of this, and Parker made a kind of a Machiavellian decision.
None of this is true. What he's about to say is not true. It's a lie.
Look, I mean, what are their choices? They could.
So, there is nothing that an incoming police chief would rather do than nail whoever killed the Black Dahlia. This is ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous.
Expose this. They could reveal it. and that would not allow them to take command because of the scandal that would be created on this. But
what scandal? What's he talking about? What
happened was, before I go on, maybe I should make this point, that the turning point was on the third day of the stakeout. There was actually a tape-recorded murder that occurred.
Oh, thank you, Steve. I knew you were going to get it. I had faith that you would get the woman screaming. Okay. I was hoping you wouldn't leave that out.
Unbelievably, as the detectives are listening in. I mean, I'm reading these transcripts and I can't believe what I'm reading. It says,
I can.
First there's a woman and she's at the house and she sounds intoxicated and she tries to telephone the operator. And
you know, I'm not. I think Steve is jamming a couple of things together. I looked at it's been a while since I looked at that transcript, but I think they say there's a woman's voice that she hadn't been heard before and she suddenly screams. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's how it went down.
She gets disconnected. Then she tries again, and the officers that are making the entry say she's crying, and she still doesn't get through to the operator. Then it's silent. Then about 3 hours later, I'm reading the transcripts, and they say George Hodel and the second man, who I identified as a baron, a German baron by the name of Moringa, who's there talking to him, and he's probably an accomplice.
Oh, probably.
He says they walk to the basement. He says,
a pipe is hit.
A pipe is hit. The object. The woman screams. Pipe is hit again. The woman screams again. Then it goes silent. I'm reading this and I'm saying, what the hell? Why aren't they? They're literally 4 minutes away. Why aren't they out the door from Hollywood detectives, Hollywood basement, police station there? And
because they're not stupid. That's why. And what is your dad doing right after that? After committing this murder and killing this woman, is he cleaning up the murder scene? Is he cleaning up the blood? Is he disposing of the body? You know what your dad is doing after that? He's typing. Yeah, he's typing. George Hodel, who just killed somebody, is like, I'm not going to worry about the body. I'm not going to worry about the blood. I'm not going to worry about cleaning up anything. I think I'll do some typing now.
Over and making rescue, but they take no action. So what we've got here is either a serious felony occurred, or I think more likely a murder, and they do nothing. And now back to Parker and Thad Brown. They're informed of this, and they can't allow this to become public. So I think what they do is a couple of Machiavellian princes. They decide, look, let's lock this away.
You know what? There were no two more. You could not find two more straight arrows in the LAPD than Bill Parker and Thad Brown. Those guys were absolutely squeaky clean, straight arrows. So no, that did not happen. William Parker was and remains extremely unpopular in the black community, for sure. I had a federal judge tell me that William Parker was the king of bastards, but in terms of covering stuff up, nah, didn't happen.
We'll take command. Parker will become chief. Thad Brown will remain chief of detectives, and we'll come back to this at a future time. You know, maybe we can find George Hodel. Maybe we won't be able to extradite him. If we do, maybe he gets Jerry Geisler, the defense attorney, and
Geisler
kicks our butt again like he did in the incest trial. Maybe
Jerry Geisler was never George Hodel's attorney. It was somebody in his office. That didn't happen either.
Better just to seal this off for now and lock it away and come back to it at a future time. Let's clean up the department, turn things around, get rid of the corruption.
Yeah, that, you know what, as I said, William Wharton, the Marine General, had gone through the department and said, it's generally pretty good. There were a few bad actors, but generally it's a pretty good department. And indeed it was. The Black Dahlia investigation was state of the art for 1947. That's the reality.
And then we can move forward. And I think that's what they did. I mean, that's all of the evidence clearly points to that. None of this came out. But the amazing part is all of the all of this was turned over to the LAPD, and it's all missing. It's all disappeared. Today's LAPD incest trial. Maybe it's better just to let it seal this off for now and lock it away and come back to it at a future time. Let's clean up the department, turn things around, get rid of the corruption, and then we can move forward. And I think that's what they did. I mean, that's all of the evidence clearly points to that. None of this came out. But the amazing part is all of this was turned over to the LAPD, and it's all missing. It's all disappeared. Today's LAPD had no idea George Hodel was a suspect. They knew none of this. The only reason we found out was the Lieutenant Jemison in the DA's office, who was assigned to investigate separately, kept a second set of books. And he locked them away in the vault, and they remained there for the last 55 years until they were initially discovered by Lopez. And then, of course, I go in and I spend 6 months reviewing it and lay it all out, and it becomes an updated chapter. But point is that the main reason for the cover-up was
there was no cover-up. Only in the mind of Steve Hodel was there a cover-up.
Murder. They couldn't allow the public to know that a murder had been.
Okay. In Steve world, this woman was killed in the Sowden house, right? Okay. So who was she? What's her name? Where's the body? What did they do with it? Why is immediately after this alleged killing, why is George Hodel typing instead of, disposing of the body and cleaning up the blood and all that other stuff? It is just Steve world. It's this fantasy that Steve promotes, and he gets gullible people to believe it who think that cops don't lie.
Committed while they're sitting there staked out on the crime. So I think that's basically the motivation for the cover-up.
There was no cover-up.
No.
Another fairly recent piece of investigation that you did, I found quite interesting. You actually went back to your childhood home with a police sergeant and a cadaver dog.
Oh, Buster the Cadaver Dog! The media loves Buster the three-legged cadaver dog who was romping around the Sowden house. Let me point out, let me emphasize that in terms of Elizabeth Short, there were no remains to find. We know where she was. She's buried up in Oakland. That's where she is. There are no missing remains.
And discovered some pretty interesting clues.
Yeah, that's part of the, again, in Black Dahlia Avenger 2, it's part of the updated. It was an amazing opportunity. I got a call from one of these programs.
Yeah, what happened was there was a TV show that said, hey, what if we get Paul Dostie and come out there with his three-legged cadaver dog and romp around and we'll shoot it. And they didn't use the footage in the show. So I forget who got a hold of it later and whatnot. But the bottom line is Buster alerted on some stuff, and they sent the soil off for tests, and it was like a year later, and Dostie said, I don't think we're ever going to get the results. And this flaky scientist said, oh yeah, tested positive remains for remains, but I think it was in something like the last 100 years. So it's like, it's really no big deal. And let me point out also, as I am pointing out things, all trained dogs, drug dogs, what have you, explosive, you have to work them all the time. They have to be constantly worked. It isn't something that they just do and they do forever. If you read up on dogs that detect drugs, they are training constantly to keep those skills sharp. I'm not sure that was happening with Buster the Cadaver Dog and his three-legged. And I would think that only having 3 legs would kind of disqualify him. I think he would have been retired at that point. But we're heading into Buster the Cadaver Dog territory. I think that's what comes next in the story.
Paranormal Ghostbusters. They said, you know, we're going to do a thing about is the house haunted or not? We'd like you to participate. And I said, no, thanks. I said, you know, I'm not into the paranormal. I said, you know, I want to keep my investigation clean. I don't want to.
Yeah, if there's one thing Steve Hodel wants to do, it's to keep his investigation clean. Yeah. Sure.
Go off on tangents, and you know, I need to be objective. And
yeah, Steve knows how to be objective. Sure he does.
And I'll pass. And they said, oh, well, we're going to have we're getting a cadaver dog to go out to the house with a handler, his handler, a retired police officer, to see if they can come up with anything. I said, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah, right. So all the fraudster, you know, yeah, it's very shaky. It's very sketchy.
In that case, I said, I'll be happy to be involved in that aspect of it, because that's legitimate forensic investigation. And I said, I'll be. So I did. I met Buster was this
Buster
Labrador, and his handler.
3 legs. 3 legs. He only had 3 legs.
Paul Dostie, who was a retired police officer, and Buster is one of the best highly trained cadaver dogs.
Because everybody's highly trained in Steve world. Highly trained, the best, blah, blah. Sounds like, never mind. I won't say who it sounds like.
And they're trained to respond only to human decomposition, not, you know, not a dead rat or a dead animal or something. They'll only alert to human decomposition, the scent of human decomposition. So we met out front of the Franklin house. This was, I think, in 2012.
And again, the show ended up not using the footage. I wonder why that would be.
And we started out there, and he gives them a search order, and Buster runs to the southwest corner of the home and alerts at a vent at the basement. Where actually the house is elevated about 10 or 12 steps. So standing there, we're actually at basement level. And he alerts there, and then we do follow-ups inside in the basement, and he alerts at 4 different places. We recover soil samples. He alerts in the back of the house, in the alley. We recover soil samples. And he's only, like I say, it's only human.
And what happened to the test samples? They went off for a long time and nothing happened. As a matter of fact, Paul Dostie said, I don't think we're ever going to get the results of those tests. That was after a year, more than a year. It was a long time.
Remains that he alerts to. So these are analyzed and they come back positive for human remains.
Yeah, they kind of did, but the scientist who did the analysis said within the last, I think it was within the last 100 years. I mean, it was certainly, you couldn't say, oh, it was done in such and such a year or such and such a date. He said within the last century, I think.
An expert, Dr. Arpad Voss, who was actually the expert they used on the odor of death in the.
Yeah, he's got a pretty sketchy background. All these sketchy guys find each other.
Was it Casey Anthony trial? He actually was the expert used in that. Anyway, he comes back and gives a formal report that it's positive for human remains.
Within what time range, Steve? Within what time range?
And there are a lot of indications that there may have been bodies buried either in the basement or, I think, more likely, in my opinion, possibly in the back alley. There was.
But nobody's going to dig for that stuff.
It's a hill, which was kind of our backyard that we used to play on.
Again, Steve Hodel only lived in that house occasionally. He was with his mom and his brothers who were floating around LA. He did not live continuously in the Sowden house from 1945 to 1950, as he claims. That didn't happen. So much of what Steve Hodel says did not happen.
And I think if there's anything buried, it could well have been up on that hill, which is now, of course, developed and stuff.
But the police aren't interested in excavating the basement?
No, but basically, LAPD's position is we're too busy with current crimes. Even the cold case unit, Mitzi Reynolds is the assigned detective, and basically we sent the reports to her and stuff, and to the chief, and Chief Beck wrote me back a letter saying we just don't have time to spend on these old cases.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's true in a number of ways. First of all, the LAPD's job is to arrest and charge and forward to the district attorney individuals who will be, potentially go to trial and be convicted. The cold case unit got into, looks at some of that stuff, but Steve Hodel, as I said, is a pariah within the LAPD because he keeps accusing them of a cover-up. So they're not really inclined to help him. And I was told by one of the cold case detectives that, if there had been anything to Steve Hodel's claims, we would have said, yeah, just to get it off the books, but it doesn't hold up. So yeah, no, they don't buy that. As far as they're concerned at this point, Steve Hodel is just a self-promoting author who's out for a little more publicity, and they aren't going to be helpful.
Which is really a bunch of BS, because I mean, frankly speaking, the thing is that what they don't want to do is see, and they can't take the position that I haven't solved it, because
oh yes, they can. They have come out and said you haven't solved it. That's how much they can't take the position. They absolutely say Steve Hodel says it hasn't solved it. And let me also add, I can list off the top of my head 5 homicide detectives who say Steve Hodel is full of it. Yeah, no, they don't buy his bullshit at all.
Their chief, the case was submitted to, and I made a presentation many years ago to the robbery homicide unit and a lot of the top brass on LAPD, with the DA transcripts and all of that. And I did it with Steve Kay, who was active head deputy DA at the time. And the chief of detectives, LAPD chief of detectives at the time, tells his guys to go ahead and clear the case based on my investigation.
No, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. Let me tell you what really happened. And this is a long story. At that point, the Los Angeles Metro Transportation had its own police department, and it was merged with the sheriff's department and the LAPD. Some of the officers went to the LAPD, some of the officers went to the sheriff's department. And there's a woman named Sharon Papa who went to the LAPD and fairly high up, and she heard Steve Hodel say, well, that's kind of interesting. Let's have let's hear what he has to say. And the people within the LAPD kind of rolled their eyes, but at the same time, they went back and did a lot of homework about the Black Dahlia case. And Steve did his dog and pony show with his crappy evidence. And the result of that was, no, it was, thank you very much, fine, and nothing came of it. They certainly never made a point of closing that case. No, they in fact said, I was told that by the cold case detective that if there'd been anything to what Steve Hodel said, we would have closed it, but nah, there's nothing. He doesn't know. He doesn't have it.
I mean, he directly tells him to clear it. He says, unless you can find some major hole. So all they can do now, and they didn't, they just kind of ignored him. He retired a year later, and basically they don't want to, I think they're viewing this as it's throwing mud on the badges of 2 of our greatest.
They're not viewing it like that at all. They see Steve Hodel as a publicity hound who is exploiting his LAPD career to sell books, which happens to be what's going on.
LAPD heroes, Chief Parker and Chief Brown.
You know what? I would bet there's almost nobody at the LAPD today who even knows who Thad Brown and William Parker are. Maybe Parker. Thad Brown, no. The old timers, yeah, but no.
And that's not the case at all. Basically, I'm not saying they were criminally involved. They're negligent in the sense that they covered it up to the point where they stopped the investigation from proceeding. But
that's not true at all. That is absolutely not true.
Basically, today's LAPD, they can't defeat the evidence. So
the evidence that you have made up, it's all made up. It's all manufactured. Brian Carr, who had the Black Dahlia case at the time, said if I went into the office with a case like that, they would laugh me out of the place.
All they can do is say, we don't have time to look at it.
Well, they don't.
The whole thing seems pretty silly. On one hand, they tell you that they just don't have the time nor the inclination to look at the case. But on the other hand, they can't give you information because they say the case is active.
Yeah, well, Steve screwed the pooch with the LAPD because he didn't ask to see the file, his dad's file, before he wrote his book. And that's what's going on there. Steve will never see his dad's file now. If he had asked to see before he wrote the book, he would have gotten it. Now he never, ever will.
And it's not active.
No, it's not active. And basically that's the only public response. That was back then. Now their position is we don't have time. We've got more important stuff to do than, well, that's what the cult.
They do have more important things to do than help out a publicity hound.
Case unit is designed for is to, and it's not like we're talking about, they haven't even looked at any of the other connected murders. Those are all unsolved on their books. You know, you're talking about clearing 8 or 9 different super cold.
All of those are unrelated. None of those fit together at all, except in Steve World, the fantasy world of Steve Hodel, where he wishes evidence into existence.
Ice cold cases, but they don't even acknowledge that those are related. And
they're not.
Today's LAPD, they just don't know the facts. I mean, you know, I've spent, in a way, you can say this has been an obsession with me, or.
I think that's true. I think that's true. It's an obsession. Yeah. Steve has spent the last 20 years constantly talking about how his dad was a serial killer and criminal genius.
You know, because I spent, years and years. Well, they don't have any idea. They didn't even know George Hodel was a suspect.
Yeah, they did. Yes, they did. They did know that.
I mean, that's how ignorant, I don't mean that in a negative way, but that's how uninformed they were on the investigation.
No, they knew George Hodel was a suspect. They knew that.
That he was even related to it. And of course, because everything was taken from their files, they would have
no. They knew he was a suspect.
No way to connect him until we discovered the new material.
No.
The LAPD has taken a beating in the last couple of decades, but official closure to the Black Dahlia case, I mean, that would be front page news. Probably the most famous open cold murder case in the United States. You'd think that the LAPD would be looking for any positive press that they could get and would jump on that publicity.
What does the LAPD have to gain from a retired officer who bashes the department about how corrupt it was and has come together with this flimsy evidence that doesn't hold up? You know, it's the best thing they could do. They say he hasn't solved it. He hasn't solved it.
Well, you would think that, and it's not like I'm some loose cannon.
Yes, Steve Hodel is a loose cannon. There's glimmers of self-awareness there. Yes, you are a loose cannon, Steve.
Had one of the highest clearance rates on the department. left the department with a sterling record.
Yeah, Steve's reputation among his peers, the other homicide detectives, was, and I quote, an okay detective with a drinking problem. That's Steve Hodel's reputation within the LAPD before he went on this nutty campaign to accuse his dad of every unsolved murder on the planet.
So it's not like this Hodel is some weirdo that's come up with
Yes, it is. It's exactly that.
A daddy dearest thing. I mean, it's the truth of this is what I've done is I've uncovered their investigation. You can say it's my investigation, but I've really uncovered their investigation, which had solved the case. So, that's what's being presented. And but again, it has to do with territoriality. It has to do with egos. There's a whole bunch of things. This detective, the one detective on the case, was Brian Carr. He's retired now, but back then his kind of attitude was, no, he hasn't even looked at the crime reports. Nobody's going to solve my case.
That isn't true at all. Brian Carr spent a lot of time studying that case and so he could be able to respond to Steve Hodel's lunacy. That is totally not true. Carr spent a lot of time. I happen to know that. He spent a lot of time going through those files. So once again, Steve Hodel is, you guessed it, full of shit.
It's just small-mindedness. The brass got it, but unfortunately, they take the lead of whoever's assigned the case. It's not like they're actually doing the investigation. They leave it to their homicide guy, and if he's a guy like Carr was, he just shuts the whole thing down.
Carr was a fine detective. He was twice the detective you will ever be. You ever were, Steve. He's an absolute straight arrow by the book guy. And you have no business running him down like that just because he doesn't endorse your stupid ideas.
My judge and jury now are my readers. And because it's all come together so strongly and there's just so much evidence now, they get it. I mean,
yeah, Steve's lunatic readers. Yeah, sure. Buy my books.
It's basically way beyond a reasonable doubt.
No, it isn't.
It's borderline or anything. So, and one of the things that their negative attitudes did was keep me moving. It forced me to keep investigating.
It has forced Steve to keep digging up more clues and more clues and more clues and more crimes and more murders. Steve is now up to his dad allegedly killing 50 people in 50 years. As I said, Steve has taken his dad, who never killed anybody, and turned him into this jet set serial killer and criminal genius. It is, frankly, bizarre. It's bizarre.
And coming up with new linkage, new evidence. There's plenty of, right now, I recently not recently, it's been a few years, in Black Dahlia Avenger 2, I came up with new DNA potential.
Yeah, there's Black Dahlia Avenger and Black Dahlia Avenger 2, and Most Awful and Most Awful 2, and there's a play, and there's a rock opera, and there's a book of haiku, and there's children's letters to the Black Dahlia Avenger, and let's see, what else is there? Beyond the Valley of the Black Dahlia Avenger, and Black Dahlia Avenger meets Billy the Kid Jr., Black Dahlia Avenger versus, of course, Godzilla. That's a popular one.
Because all of the original mailings disappeared. Well,
yeah, but it doesn't matter because there's no proof. First of all, there's no proof that they were from your dad, except for, I recognize my dad's handwriting, and there is no proof that they're from the killer. As far as the original investigators were concerned, only the first envelope was from the killer, and they knew that because it had her belongings in it. That's how they knew. Otherwise, no. Crackpot mail.
I've discovered that it looks like they may have some mailings from my father that could possess DNA. and I have my father's full DNA profile now. I've been able to get that since about 3 years ago. I got a full profile from some letters he mailed to me. Was able to establish a full profile from my own independent laboratory.
What does it matter? It doesn't matter, because even if he mailed those letters, which he didn't, there's nothing to show that they were from the killer. There's nothing to show that they were anything more than prank mail. But he didn't do it.
Work done at FBI lab. So I have his profile, and all we need to do is get DNA from this one of these two new mailings that they have. But they, again, Chief Beck wrote me back and says, we just don't have time to. I said, give me an hour and I'll explain the new evidence. He said, sorry, we just don't have time. So basically, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I mean, it's been 10, 12 years now.
As I said, Steve Hodel is a pariah within the LAPD. They are not going to give him any more ink.
I don't expect LAPD to respond, but there's been a lot of coverage on it, a lot of shows done on it. And
yeah. Steve Hodel has stood on every street corner in Los Angeles and bellowed about how his dad was a serial killer and criminal genius. He has made it his mania.
And now I've linked with all of the new linkage to murders outside of Los Angeles. I have some, linkage to Chicago.
Yeah. George Hodel sank the Titanic and he blew up the Hindenburg and who knows what else.
Chicago murders back then, and to one in Manila, which was a copycat identical to the Black Dahlia, a woman posed on a vape.
Oh, Steve is coming dangerously close to map torture, where he talks about this body was left here with this street name, and this street name is like that. Let's see if he's going to go there. If he does, I will tell you now that he stole that idea. As stupid as it is, he didn't even think that up. He stole it.
Lot a mile from Dad's home, surgically bisected.
Now he said a mile. Did you hear that? Did you hear what he said? He said the body in Manila was left. Okay, what he's talking about a murder in the Philippines, and I don't know if he'll get into it here. There was a body. He talks about this body being left in a street called Zodiac in Manila, and he said Dad lived a mile away. It's actually more than that. It was a couple of kilometers, depending on which house he was living in. Steve, in later presentations, moves that so that his dad is only 2 blocks away. One of the interesting things about Steve Hodel, in a bizarre sort of way, is he keeps changing his story. Numbers get inflated. Things get moved around to get, forced into his weird scenario. He keeps changing the story. You can't leave it alone.
I mean, it's just a copycat Black Dahlia, and it's one of Manila's most famous unsolved victims, Lucilla Lalou. And then, of course, the Bay Area, and it's just been amazing.
Yeah, he was Zodiac. Are we going to talk about Zodiac?
How much information has come forward since. So the good part is it kept pushing me to dig deeper and deeper and get where we're now at now. We're left it to where there's no doubt any longer.
Yes, there is. There's lots of doubt, lots and lots of doubt from me, chronic naysayer.
So you just alluded to some of the other murders in other parts of the country and the world that you suspect your father might have a connection to, including San Francisco.
Zodiac and Suzanne Degnan. Let's see, which way will he go? Will he go with Zodiac or will he go with Suzanne Degnan? Either way, I'm ready.
So I'd like to start by asking you about the Zodiac killer, who operated in that area and who you think might actually be your father.
Well, as bizarre as that.
Well, I mean, the reality, Steve Hodel will, as always, recognize his dad's handwriting because he's good at that. And the coded messages were from his dad using some kind of Celtic cipher or some damn thing. And in reality, George Hodel was in the Philippines. And so for him to be Zodiac Steve is going to need to have him jetting back to San Francisco, off somebody, and then go back to the Philippines. And Steve never lays any groundwork as to, oh yeah, I can show that on this, and this date, my dad was in San Francisco. Now, it's just easier to say, oh, that's a thought print or a mind print or a blinking red light, or I recognize my dad's handwriting, or that's his MO, or that's his signature. He doesn't bother with, oh, I can actually establish that my dad was, in the United States, in San Francisco at that time. He doesn't mess with little trivial details like that.
I came out with Most Evil, which was the sequel.
Most awful.
And in that, I didn't say in the case of Salt, I said, we need to look at him, and I laid out a strong.
Oh, you know what? The other thing Steve Hodel will do that shows you what a liar he is, he will take a book illustration, something off a book cover, and he will claim that that's a police composite. Nah, it's not a police composite. It's an illustration off a book jacket. And Steve knows that. He just prefers to call it a police composite because that's how he is. The guy lies 24/7. Every word out of his mouth is a lie.
Case, at least a circumstantial case, as to why he may have reinvented himself, come back in the 60s and reinvented himself as Zodiac. But now I've just come out with, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Most Evil 2, which is amazing because what happened.
Yeah. Why is Steve laughing? Why is Steve laughs at such weird times? Yes, there is Most Evil and there's Most Evil 2 and, Valley of Most Evil and I don't know. On and on and on.
Was, in addition, I came up with a lot of new evidence, but in addition to that, a Frenchman solved one of those authenticated Zodiac ciphers, and Dad's actually signed his name in a code to that. I mean, it leaves no doubt.
Yeah, it's like Steve seeing Hodel in every painting in a museum. It's like, if you know how Steve thinks and how he looks, you can find a Hodel in every painting.
It's actually signed. He signed it, one of the mailings to the San Francisco Chronicle. He signs it with the Zodiac signature, and then it's Hodel. Hodel. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. And this guy actually cracked it. It's based on, again, it brings it back to surrealism and some artwork and some ciphers in an old Celtic language.
Yeah, because the Hodels were Celtic, right? They weren't persecuted Russian Jews. They were Celtic. Okay.
Where he used to sign his actual name. So it's huge. It's not like iffy. It's not like, are you seeing is this a Rorschach test? No. It's 5 letters from this.
Yes, it is. You can find an Hodel anywhere.
No, ancient alphabet. And they spell out Hodel.
I'm looking forward to getting my hands on that book. So I also wanted to ask you about the Chicago lipstick mark.
Suzanne Degnan. Okay, here is the stupid idea which Steve stole from a crackpot. There was a crackpot website called Black Dahlia Solution Info something. I am not going to give you the exact URL because it's so goofy, and it's still out there, even though the guy is dead. The guy, this goofball found all kinds of hidden messages in the crackpot mail, and he came up with the name Ed Burns from these letters in a very weird way. Anyway, one of his claims was that the body of Elizabeth Short, which was left on Norton Avenue, was a pointer to Degnan, which is 2 blocks away. I think it's 2 blocks, 3 blocks, something like that, as a pointer to the murder of Suzanne Degnan, a little girl in Chicago, horribly killed the year before in January of 46. Steve may say that, oh yeah, there was a street named Hollywood near the Degnan, I think it's the Degnan residence, and Elizabeth Short. Now more recently he's gotten crazier, where he says Elizabeth Short's body was left off Degnan. Well, it was a couple blocks away. And then he gets into a Jean French thing where he says her body was left on Mountain View, taunting the police to refer to the name of the cemetery where Elizabeth Short is buried. No, that is not the street that Jean French was left on. It's just nuts. It's just goofy. It'll be interesting to see how far along Steve Hodel is in this goofy theory, whether he gets into. Okay, let's go.
We're nearing the end of the interview, so maybe we can leave this one for a longer episode another day. But could you talk about those murders briefly and why you think your dad might have been involved?
Yeah, well, basically, the reason I looked at, I would have never gone to the lipstick. There were three lipstick murders that occurred in Chicago in 1945 and January of 46. Three different ones. 2 adult women were killed, and one child, a little girl, was kidnapped.
That's Suzanne Degnan.
And surgically bisected, and
it's not clear that she was bisected. That's a Steve Hodel thing. She was cut up, according to the newspapers, by a guy named William Hirons. He cut off her arms and legs and head, and he hid the body parts in various catch basins and storm drains in that area. He had been, among other things, a delivery boy for a liquor store, so he knew that neighborhood. But the point is, unlike the murder of Elizabeth Short, where her body was posed, nobody was ever supposed to find the remains of Suzanne Degnan. He put them in the catch basin so they would never, ever be found. Totally different. Totally different.
And, there's a whole bunch of reasons. Like you say, we don't have time for me to summarize it. There are 3 chapters in Most Evil, the first book, which is my sequel. And the reason I went there was because Elizabeth Short forced me to go there. I discovered in the DA transcripts that she went back to Chicago and was actively investigating the lipstick murders.
That is utter bullshit. Elizabeth Short left Medford, Mass. She stopped in Indianapolis. She stopped in Chicago for a few weeks and then went to LA. She never went back to Chicago to investigate anything. That is just total nut jobbery. It's not in the DA's files. It's not anywhere.
Back in 1946, just months before she was killed. And this may have been what signed her death warrant with George Hodel. Was she actually slept with a couple of the newspaper reporters.
That's not true either.
Who were writing the articles on these murders, wanting to get information and stuff, and she was there, and they were constantly trying to get information on the lipstick murders. And I'm reading this in the DA files. I think
it's not in the district. None of that. Not a word of this story is in the district attorney's files, and he is depending on your ignorance and his career as a police officer that you will believe it. No, not a word of that is in the DA's files. Nothing. He's making up all of this.
What is this all about? Why is she back there and looking at these crimes and stuff?
Didn't happen.
Then she comes back to LA and suddenly starts running. Dad returns unexpectedly from China, and she starts running and disappears, goes to San Diego, and then of course we've discussed that the policewoman said that there's a man threatening to kill me.
Yeah, no, as I pointed out in the first part of the video, the policewoman made an identification based on a description. Once she saw the photograph of Elizabeth Short, she said, maybe not. She walked it back.
And then the next day, her body's found. So anyway, she's the one that turned me on to them, and there's a whole bunch of linkage in regards to why I believe George Hodel committed those crimes. There was a 17-year-old boy by the name of Bill Hirons that he was arrested and he confessed.
Yes, he did confess. That is actually true and accurate. I'm not sure he was a boy. He was in his late teens. He was a big guy. He had a record for burglaries. Hirons was a burglar. And so a couple of the victims were, if I remember correctly, they came home and surprised him while he was burglarizing their homes, and he killed them. I'm pretty sure that's how it went down. One of the last burglaries he did was an apartment near the Degnan home, and the home had a view of the Degnan home and of Suzanne Degnan's bedroom. So there is pretty convincing evidence, along with Hirons' confession, that Hirons did it, and I believe Hirons did it.
But it was a false confession. He immediately took it back, but he spent the last 60 whatever years in jail. He just died in jail for those crimes, but there was never any trial, no evidence, anything.
Well, Steve, I don't know what you learned in your many years with the LAPD, but if somebody confesses to something, they don't get a trial. There is no trial. So of course he didn't get a trial. He confessed. How can you not know that? How can you not know that? How were you ever a cop? How can you sit there and say that and expect people to believe it when it is utter crap?
It's just his confession, and it's detailed in length in Most Evil.
Is there evidence that your dad might have been in Chicago in 1945?
Well,
It's actually 46. What's the host name? Eric? No, there isn't anything. Steve has done zero homework to show that George Hodel was in Chicago.
In his position as, head of LA County Health.
No, he wasn't head of any LA County Health. He was head of communicable diseases. He was never head of the health department. Yet another Steve Hodel lie.
They had an office in Washington, D.C. Chicago was a midpoint. So I can't, obviously, there are no records to establish that.
But I want it to be true. That's almost as good as it being true as I really, really want it to be true. Right?
I can put him there, but that was the, stopping place for him. But there's more than that. It's actually.
I recognize his MO.
We don't have time to get into it, but there's actually the name of the little victim, just to give a quick teaser, the name of the little.
Yeah, Degnan, here it is. Here comes the stupid idea that Steve stole. Stole it. Is there anything worse than stealing? Even worse than stealing an idea is stealing a really, really stupid idea.
Victim, the little girl, was Degnan. And Dad actually posed Elizabeth Short's body after he bisected it on the street here on Degnan, even though.
No. I am going to rewind that because I think he said he left her body on Degnan. Now, I thought I heard him say that once before. It was actually, he is a little bit more correct by saying off Degnan. But let's go back.
It was Norton. It was actually Degnan becomes Norton. It splits off. It's actually the same street. And he thought he was on Degnan, and Degnan becomes the quick teaser. The name of the little victim, the little girl, was Degnan.
Yeah.
And Dad actually posed Elizabeth Short's body after he bisected it on the street here on Degnan.
No. No, no, no. No. That is bullshit. Didn't happen. Norton Avenue. Famously, Norton between 39th and Rodeo. Okay. Let's see how Steve digs himself out of that hole.
Even though everybody thinks it was Norton, it was actually.
Everybody thinks that because that's what it is.
Degnan becomes Norton. It splits off. It's actually the same street. And he thought he was on Degnan, and he posed the body there. Again, another taunting clue. I've never even heard of the name Degnan.
I never heard of the name Degnan. Therefore, it never existed. It's new information. Okay, now that is a big, fat lie. Degnan is not Norton. It is never Norton. Norton Avenue goes all across the city of Los Angeles. Okay.
And you'll see how it all links. You know, I mean, you have to kind of read the chapters to get how it all comes together. But yeah, he also, the little girl in Degnan, he performed a hemicorpectomy on.
No, I'm not sure she was cut in half, and that procedure that Steve is talking about did not exist in 1947 and 1946. No, didn't exist. This is, again, total Steve Hodel bullshit.
Her body, which is the same surgical procedure that he did on Elizabeth Short, going between the second, third lumbar vertebrae, which is the only way you can divide a body without going through bone. So he did it on a little girl, and he did it again on Elizabeth Short. And it's just, I mean, amazing amount of.
Yeah, let me just note very quickly, William Hirons was a hunter. He knew how to dress game. He had dress game. He was also into taxidermy. So yeah, he knew somewhat how to dress game, how to cut up a body. He had some idea of how to do it.
Linkage to those crimes. And it all fits together. It's all, again, part of
No,
this.
it doesn't fit together at all.
Bizarre murders of fine art. He'll carry this posing on street names and stuff into his San Francisco crimes.
What's flabbergasting is that Elizabeth Short, who you've described as 22 going on 14, has the gumption and the motivation to actively investigate a trio of murders.
Yeah, except that didn't happen. That is total fantasy. That is just nutso. No, didn't happen.
From the portrait you paint of her in the Black Dahlia Avenger book, it just doesn't seem like something that she'd do.
Yeah, that's right.
Suddenly, she's the second coming of Nellie Bly.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's what signed her death warrant, really, was that I think she probably let him know that, either joking or not joking or something, that she was.
How would she let him know that? They didn't have any contact. There was no contact between Elizabeth Short and George Hodel at all. It's just nuts. This is all just crazy, crazy talk.
You know, looking at those crimes and stuff, because he quit his job with UNRWA as a medical officer in China and came back here, and she immediately began running for her life. So I'd say that very likely that they were connected.
If people want to connect with you, learn more about you,
I have a website, buy my books, buy my books, buy my books.
how would they do it?
BlackDahliaAvenger.com is my website, and there's a Squad Room blog. You click on that, and I have all, I've been blogging for 8-10 years now. So there's a huge amount of it. There's also a frequently asked questions section. All of my books are available both on.
Buy my books!
Through Amazon.
I think I'm going to get a bingo here. Pretty sure.
So basically, there's 10 years of investigative documentation laid out on my website, stevehodel.com.
Steve Hodel, thank you again for your time.
Okay, Eric, it's been a pleasure, and best to you, and good luck.
This has been another episode of the Most Notorious podcast.
Okay, I'm going to talk over the music here so I don't get a copyright strike.
And please, if you haven't done so,
And we are done. Okay. That was more crazy Steve Hodel stuff. He does get into the Elizabeth Short wasn't left on Norton. She was left on Degnan. Well, okay, people think it was Norton. Norton and Degnan were the same street. It's like, no. Ugh, okay. And that ends part 2 of the Most Notorious podcast. If you get here, you definitely deserve a gold star. And that's it. So long for now.